Hi folks, this is Dr. Surasinghe again. This is the second part of my lecture on applications of soundscape ecology. Right, let's see what we have here for you. So, what is the research potential that we can explore or that is available for us through soundscape ecology? Well, it improves the measurements and the quality of the sounds, right? So we do have, right? The science of soundscape ecology, the usage of that actually, we discussed that it has a long history. It's nothing recent. But we do need to make improvements on how we measure the soundscape, how we record it, and then how we quantify it, right? So in this aspect, we need to improve of the technology we have to automate the recordings, right? I mean, you don't have to have an actually automated machine, like except for bats or ultrasonic based vocalizations. For those, yes, you need a specific device. But if you are only looking at birds or amphibians or any acoustic signatures, most of them you can hear, right, in your surrounding environment. So by a manual effort, right, but with manual labor, you can actually go to a particular environment, spend particular amount of set time, um, let's say 1 hour, 2 hour in certain frequencies within the day or over the days, and manually design a protocol to record the soundscape, right? And then there are several similar protocols um, that exist for birds and amphibians, less so for insects. So, but we need to develop automated recording technology, right? That's what we talked about during our field trips. And those automated devices need to improve in terms of how they are triggered and how much they can record and what kind of different frequency ranges they can actually collect data from simultaneously. Um, and also, what we need to do is actually, automate not just the recording part, but also the analysis part, right? Automatically, if we can calculate different types of bioacoustic indices, that would be like, great, and that will improve our understanding of a particular soundscape, and also at least to identify the source, right? Is it biological, anthropological, or geophonic, right? And if it is biological, then of course, if can we zoom into the species, can we identify what particular species it's emitting, right? So all of those actually is going to be costly. Particularly the recording equipment is pretty costly. Thanks goodness to most of the open source software development community. There's a lot of analytical tools that are freely available. I'll briefly talk about them later on, but the actual construct of the equipment that does the recording is very expensive, right? And some of the software that is, licensed software, like the one that Professor Amor is using, is extremely expensive. Um, and also, the future developments should strive to understand the differences, the compositional differences in the sonic signature, like how two different sonic signatures differ in terms of its signature composition. Secondarily, need to improve our understanding of spatial temporal dynamics across different spatial scales, right? So how soundscape vary in response to variation in the landscape processes and patterns, right? So the same habitat or the same organism, same taxa can occur in different landscapes, right? Or they can occur within different patterns of landscapes, right? So the soundscape that originates even from the same biota across different landscapes patterns under different landscape processes is going to vary. Um, so we need to understand how the soundscape vary in response to variations in the landscape land use patterns, right? Because we know that the geomorphology, right, the topography, and even the human constructed cultural landscape can impede the propagation of the soundscape. And how soundscape metrics vary in response to as a function of vegetation structure or other forms of structural diversity is important, right? because vegetation structure, the canopy structure, vegetation cover, the sparseness of the vegetation, density of the vegetation, all of those actually kind of modify the propagation of the sound signals. Soundscape versus variable temporal resolutions. So, what is temporal resolution? Well, that's actually how you measure time, right? So, if you record the soundscape over a day, you actually have a huge volume of data, right? But that's easy. That's actually, conveniently doable. But there could be some very small sound signatures happening at much more smaller temporal scale. How about within hours? Well, how about within a minute? How about within seconds, right? So the smaller the temporal unit at which you measure the soundscape, right? The more rich, more enriched your soundscape variables are going to be, because certain very unique signatures of sonic signals, right, could be limited to a very small temporal scale. For example, if you break down a 1 minute unit, a 1 minute long call of a frog or a toad, right? The toads are known to call for very long durations. What if you break it down to seconds, right? You might see subtle variations, right, within the same call that you could not capture if you look at the entire 1 minute, right? So the further you can break down into smaller time units across the temporal resolution, the better you can interpret and understand the subtle variation in the acoustic signatures or the sound signals that you collected. It's also important to understand, necessary to understand, how environmental variables influence the soundscape, right? The biophysical environment can modify the soundscape. Well, how that happens is something we need to understand. How how the soundscape vary with respect to weather, how that is impacted by differential exposure to solar radiation, how that vary in response to Grovin degrees, how does that vary with respect to heat index, moisture budget. All of those are important to understand. Now there are two aspects, right? The solar radiation exposure, Grovin degrees. Grovin degrees is an indication of cumulatively how much heat is available in a particular environment in a given time scale, right? Kind of heat index and Grovin degrees are very positively correlated with each other, right? And moisture budget. So all of those weather variables or proxies of weather or climate, on one hand, can influence the biofauna by driving species behaviors. Secondarily, all of those weather variables can change the physical structure of a habitat, and then influence the propagation of sound signals. So it is important to understand how these variables, environmental variables, drive the soundscape structure. And plasticity of biophonic signatures with variable geophony. So animals produce biophony, right? And they can actually sense how, like any sound producing animal can sense how their physical environment, right, the geophonic, the natural abiotic sounds, right, interfere with their signals. So certain species have the ability to modify um, the sonic signatures they develop so that their vocal signatures are not smothered in the geophony, right? A simple example would be in rainy environments or in windy environments, how does amphibians respond, right? Certain species actually, actually many species during high wind situations tend not to vocalize, maybe because, the vocalizations could be carried away with their sounds. There are other reasons for that. In high wind situations, amphibians can also undergo dehydration, so as a result they may be behaviorally inactive. But another explanation could be that wind carries away or attenuates their signatures, right? So that's a really important thing to understand. Anthropogeny versus biophony, right? How does anthropogenic noise impact biophony, and how does animals that are responsible for biophony change their behavior to circumvent the problems presented by anthrophony, right? Is it a behavioral modification, right? How about um, biophony varying with respect to predator-prey interactions, because predators can actually sample the sounds produced by prey, interpret that soundscape, and use that to target successful prey capture, right? How does that predator-prey evolution is influenced by the predator's ability to decode the prey soundscape, right? And how does the physiology, the ecophysiology, impacts sound generation by certain organisms, right? And then technophony versus biophony. Well, anthrophony is any form of sound that is produced within the cultural landscape by human activities. Technophony is actually the novel aspects of the anthrophony, that those are the sound signatures or the acoustic signatures or non-acoustic signatures, like ultrasonic signatures that are produced by the technological applications of humans, from cell phone towers it could be, right? Or it could be from any other broadcasting signals that are produced by humans, right? How can those novel technological innovations pollute the soundscape, right? And how that impacts the biophony? You may have heard about the negative impacts of radio towers, cell phone towers on birds or bats. So those are really interesting things to explore. And also what we need to realize in terms of a conservation perspective, how can we use the soundscape based knowledge we develop to develop environmental policies to protect the soundscape, to prevent sound pollution, is extremely important. Speaking of physiology, we know anthrophony and technophony can actually induce a physiological stress, a neurological stress to humans as well as to other forms of animals, right? So understanding that physiological manifestations of stress is also helpful to produce mitigatory actions or to design policies to minimize the impact of anthropogenic or technophonic pollution on overall soundscape. Discussing further more about how soundscape research should progress in future. How does increased noise pollution impact human health? Something it's very much related to the point 3 we just discussed, right? I did mention the physiological stress could manifest, right? And then, well, there's always a threshold level, right? A certain level of pollution through anthrophony and technophony can be tolerated by animals and humans, right? But where is that threshold? That threshold is going to be variable from different species to different species. It will vary between different species, among different species. Could it also vary across different populations that occur in different geographic locations, right? Will age has to do anything with that? How about sex, right? Are more mature individuals more resilient to sound pollution? Are younger individuals more susceptible to that? Cultural aspects, right? Well, are humans that have exposed to greater noise pollution are developing more neurological and endocrinological resilience to sound pollution, right? How about the same thing regarding wildlife? Are urban wildlife more resilient to noise pollution than the same species occupying a rural habitat? Well, those are really interesting questions to answer. Can animals exploit certain landforms to propagate biophony? We know that there's an interaction between the biophony and the geophony, right? So can certain animals use certain time of the day to better propagate their sound signatures, because during that time of the day, because of the certain characteristic of the atmosphere, can sound propagate unattenuated to a longer distance? If that is the case, can animals use those time frames of the day or a particular season to better communicate their better communicate with the environment, or better to send signatures to whatever the recipients they are targeting? Do animals use certain elements of the landscape, right? Are certain geographic locations, certain microhabitats better to emit a particular signature, right? Are there certain perch heights that are better or more advantageous for a calling male to recruit more females? Does certain perch heights propagate certain sound signatures further away, right? Or does a particular location signify their fitness in tandem with the fitness currencies embedded in the sound signature? Um, and in fact, there are several examples coming from the South African savannas, right? There are several examples from ungulates, from mammals, that actually indicates that they actually use both different times of the day as well as different locations in the landscape um, to best propagate sound, right? And southern African savannas are, like, geographically not that complex. Of course there are some rugged terrain, but even in such simple landscapes, relatively simple, less complicated landscapes, there are evidence that certain time of the day and certain landscape points are better or beneficial for animals to emit their vocal signatures. How do we increase detection of certain elements of the soundscape that are hard to detect by conventional equipment, that are undetectable by the human ears? Ultrasonic signatures cannot be detected by humans. Well, in order to study bats, we probably need to actually improve our technology to sample that, right? And insect signals. There are so many signals generated by insects that either are within the ultrasonic range, or even if they are within the acoustic level, human ears are not receptive to those. Conventional recording devices will not record those. And how about sound propagation through other media? Most of the devices we have right now, that the ones that you saw in the lab activities, in the field trips, those are equipped to collect signatures, sound signals coming through air. How about water? Right? Fish do communicate with sounds. Mammals, aquatic mammals do the same. Right? Amphibians could call from water. Right? So it's important to understand how to collect sound signatures that are propagating through solids, like along the ground, or through water. Develop soundscape metrics and interpretation, right? So we need to develop different type of metrics. We only have very limited metrics as of now, right? There are very basic metrics that are characteristics of the sonogram, right? And of course, then based on those signals, we can actually interpret different indexes. But we need to develop certain objective, the unbiased, easy to interpret indexes, metrics that actually have so much information in it, that reflects different properties of the sonogram, right? That are easily measurable, easily quantifiable. And in fact, the devices that does that job has to be remotely operable, right? It could be something you can program and deploy, or even program remotely, right, through satellite connections, or through Wi-Fi, or through Bluetooth, right? You know that Wi-Fi, Bluetooth are not the best technology, so we need to have some sort of other remote access point or mechanisms, which negates the necessity to frequently visit the field for the purpose of programming or reprogramming, right? And of course, passive, right? There should be some sort of a triggering mechanism, right, where the recording device is triggered by, for a particular time of the day, right, or triggered by a particular sound, right? So there should be some sort of a way to, some sort of a mechanism to trigger the activation of the recording devices. And I will talk later about what rapid biodiversity assessments are, because this remotely deployable passive recording devices that sample the soundscape, right, are good proxies, or collect data that are proxies of the overall biodiversity, at least the biodiversity that are, or the wildlife that are able to produce sound. And those sound emitting forms of biodiversity are proxies of other forms of biodiversity in the same environment, right? I mean, think about this animals we can sample based on sounds. Bats, other forms of mammals, amphibians, well, not all amphibians, frogs and toads, birds, all of those animals in combination actually can indicate insects, right? So all of those are good proxies of other forms of biodiversity that doesn't necessarily emit a sound, like plants and other animals that are quote unquote deaf, or sound deaf, or mute, whatever it is. So so those techniques can be used as a means for rapid biodiversity assessments, and later on I will actually catch back on and explain what rapid biodiversity assessments are. So we also need to create and store open access training data sets. So the biggest impediments when it comes to designing tools, computer-based algorithms for automated species identification, is that we don't have enough data, annotated data, that actually has some sort of a species identification tag, right? So we need to create copious amount of data on different species, right? And there are sound signals, and then kind of annotate each sound signature for a particular species, right? And sometimes what happens is, there are within species variations, so we need to have multiple number of records from the same species emitted by different individuals, or the same individuals under different ages in different locations within its range. So we need to have a rich data set that we can use as training data to train artificial intelligence systems, machine learning algorithms, to decode the soundscape, right? And of course, we need to collect data from different types of field conditions, from urban environments, from rural environments, and from in between, from mountains to lowlands, right? So we need to enrich this data set. And also, yes, I mentioned the importance of within species variation. Of course, between species variation is really important, but cannot let go the within species variation, because the training we do when we are designing an AI for soundscape decoding, right, requires to understand variations within species as well as between species. And also that data should be open access, right? The software that you guys are being trained on is not open access. It's a licensed expensive software. So that library it comes up with is not free, right? And there are many other software that is used for bet analysis, like Anabet, right? For instance, right? That's also not free. The library you have to purchase, but if you have money, if you have grant money like we did, great. But if you don't have it, that should not prevent you from doing soundscape research. So that's why it is extremely important to create open access data. So it's also important to have cleaned up biophonic signatures that actually specifically pinpoint to a particular species vocalizations. Then we need to have multiple species vocalizations in mixture. Then we need to have single species vocalizations amidst its conventional natural background signatures, right? So multiple species with the background sound signal. So you need to collect data with different levels of complexities and noise. What drives the soundscape, right? That's the ultimate question, right? So soundscape variability, exists among different taxa in different ecosystems, right? Different ecosystem processes or patterns, right, can also drive the soundscape variability. And we did mention earlier how biophysical structure, can impact species behaviors, animal behaviors, and how can that drive variations in the soundscape. Environmental constraints can also limit how far a particular signal can propagate, right? And then, well, what is the impact of invasive species, right? Can invasive species that are, alien to a particular habitat, when they invade that habitat, take over the bioacoustic space and compete for the acoustic niche with native species? If that is the case, how that is going to impact the communication ability of the native species? Well, will they evolve to move and shift their niche, or will they actually develop some other alternative strategy for effective communication, right? How will this invasive native communication co-evolve over time? There are lots of interesting questions, research areas that you can think about endlessly. So, what are soundscape based disturbance indicators? We do know, we have talked about, we have a whole field of disturbance ecology, right, where we try to understand how different types of natural and anthropogenic disturbances impact the community structure, ecosystem processes, right? So we can apply the same principle to disturbances in the soundscape, right? What is the baseline, for example, right, for naturalness, right? So anything exceeding that naturalness in the soundscape can be defined as deviation from the baseline, right? So that is actually the indication of the disturbances. Well, can we use that kind of shifts from the baseline in the soundscape to indicate environmental change, right? And is there a threshold to that particular environmental change, right? How much deviation from the baseline of the soundscape should we experience to have a measurable um, major shift in the environmental changes, right? So this is when you actually need a greater level of temporal resolution in collecting this or sampling the soundscape, right? Um, because conventional field-based manual soundscape sampling has a very limited exposure time, right? I mean, for amphibian protocols, it's like 5 minutes for a particular habitat. In certain cases, it's like 2 minutes for a particular habitat. For birds, well, not more than 45 minutes for a particular point, right, where you're surveying. So if you were to develop this disturbance indicators based on soundscape, well, you need to enhance the temporal resolution of sampling, right? Go way outside the conventional monitoring windows. Both in terms of the within the day or even like across a year, across an active season, right? So this way you can actually assess soundscape based disturbance indicators in terms of the phenological responses like breeding calls, um, and that can also be helpful to understand distribution shifts, right? Because if, for example, if a particular bird species is calling earlier, right, that's an indication of environmental change with respect to climatic disturbances, okay? Distribution shifts. If you can sample the soundscape, if you hear a particular species that were not supposed to occur in a particular area, well, that is evidence for certain species changing their distribution ranges in response to maybe climate change, maybe in response to loss of original habitats, right? And so large scale data rich geographically widespread comparative analysis. We need to most of the current soundscape analyses are based on a single location, right? You know, for example, there's a lot of soundscape based studies going on in the Great Lakes area, mostly restricted to the Lake Michigan area, but we need to expand that location specific studies and collect voluminous data, right? Create huge databases and then increase our geographic interests. Well, compare multiple locations within an ecoregion. Well, compare between two different adjacent geographical locations, right? So include comparative analysis as opposed to within location analysis. So those are the ways we need to enhance the spatial resolution or the spatial extent of soundscape research, right? How can we understand changes in species richness with respect to soundscape, right? How do we understand compositional changes? Well, how do we interpret community dynamics, community shifts, community alterations by sampling soundscape, right? Well, better yet, can those soundscape based disturbance indicators also indicate not just community changes, not just community dynamics? Can those also indicate shifts in ecosystem function and ecosystem structure? Well, can soundscape based disturbance indicators indicate shifts in animal behavior, changes in social organization, changes in group selection, right? Can that indicate changes in migratory patterns, migratory timing, okay, or changes in migratory ranges, right? Can we detect cohesion or dissociation of group selection or mating strategies based on soundscape indicators? So generally, you know, what are the different ways we can understand changes to environmental quality and environmental health based on those disturbance indicators of the soundscape, right? So to address all of those, we need to come up with methodological developments and improvements, right? So we are talking about designing novel protocols, right, that actually go beyond conventional individual or person based or manual measurements, right? You need to come up with new standards in terms of doing these performing these activities, right? um, produce programmable recorders and design protocols how to use them for different purposes in different environments, right? And also, if we are talking about developing databases, cross-regional analysis, we need to have the cyber infrastructure to facilitate that, facilitate storage, facilitate easy access, a way to pipeline data from data storage units to your laptops, to your computers, right? So processors, right? Computer processors, memories that can actually analyze this voluminous data. And those processors, like computer processors, cannot be expensive, right? Like interestingly, most of the microprocessors that we use in handheld recording devices are very cheap, right? It ranges from like $10 to $50 maximum. But when you are actually analyzing data, right, the random access memories in your computers, and other computer processors has to work faster and very efficiently, right? I mean, the most currently available, commercially available Intel cores might not be sufficient, right? So that should be like, the development of technology has to happen largely within the cyber infrastructure in computer sciences, in the hardware. So also we need to do all of these things at global scale. Doing this just at national scale is insufficient, right? That will actually limit the progress in this field. So we need to have like a global network of scientists to produce databases, to come up with standards, to come up with protocols, right? So this has to move to an international research arena. Particularly this is important for us because most of the progresses that happens in the soundscape ecology thus far has happened in Europe and South America. So so we need to have this international collaboration, right, to do this. So this diagram, I'm not going to go into every detail because it actually is self-explanatory. It kind of sums up everything I explained so far, right? So we need developments in the metrics of soundscape, and how we interpret that, right, has to be improved. And then that actually leads to better understanding of the processes driving the soundscape, right? And all of that collectively can be used to understand, to decode how anthropogenic or natural disturbances alter the landscape, right? Alter the soundscape, of course, and thereby, ergo the landscape and the entire ecosystem structure. And you can also understand that largely, in this diagram, the most of the contributions to understand the soundscape come from ornithologists, right? 50% of that comes from ornithology, right? So the world of insect soundscape, amphibian soundscape, and then all the other forms of soundscapes, mammalian soundscape, all of these needs to catch up, right? It should not be 50-50, 50% by birds and all the other taxa by all the other organisms. There should be better integration of other taxa when we're exploring the soundscape, right? So and generally, like, all the research objectives, all these research themes that I discussed can be kind of boiled down to 3 objectives, right? Development of the soundscape metrics and the interpretation of that at individual level, species level, community level, ecosystem level. Then again, developments in understanding the soundscape drivers, the processes that is structuring the soundscape, again at individual/population level, multiple species level, right, within a community or across communities, within ecosystems, across ecosystems, right? And the same thing regarding the third objective, kind of tuning up all of those knowledges to develop soundscape based disturbance indicators to understand how changes, shifts in individual to population to community to ecosystem level happens, right? To understand those fluctuations, those variations in response to disturbances based on soundscape based disturbance indicators, right? The biggest advantage by doing all of is that actually, well, doing that is going to take a long time, a lot of effort, right? But when you have the structure, the infrastructure developed, the technology developed, the science developed, the mathematics and statistical applications developed, computer science infrastructure developed, doing this will be easier, right? It's going to be cheaper, less labor intensive, at least less intensive in terms of hard labor, right? And the data that we collect will be voluminous, right? What we learn will be much greater than what we do right now. So long way to go, by the way. I don't know when we will realize those goals. Well, it's interesting even to think about it. So what are the costs and benefits of automated call recorders? Well, the costs are, they are always going to, going to be costly in terms of the equipment wise, right? So we can actually use these automated recording devices to assess biodiversity in a particular environment before some development takes place, right? So for example, imagine a particular wetland, right, in your neighborhood, right? And then maybe a particular private company proposed to develop that into a shopping complex, right? Or a, I don't know, parking lot, right? So before the city, right, or the state approves that work, right, the city and the state, the government has to understand whether it's okay to develop that environment. How much biodiversity, wildlife are we going to lose because of the development? Well, the state or the city or the government does not have enough time to do an assessment, a broad biodiversity assessment. The best way to do that is actually surveying the soundscape, right? So that kind of activities, right, could also be related to, right, assessing biodiversity or the wildlife richness in a particular habitat, in a forest, in a woodland before logging, right? USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, United States Forest Service require to do things like that, right? Because their properties are frequently leased to private sector for logging, right? But logging cannot be done indiscriminatingly, right? They have to pick certain locations that are suitable for logging. But the downside is it's hard to do it with manual labor to sample multiple species. So Soundscape is a great tool for those federal organizations to survey the habitat in a shorter period of time and get a broader understanding about the biodiversity, and thereby what areas are suitable to be logged, what areas should be avoided from logging, right? Conservation organizations, private, public, and governmental, requires to make conservation decisions. Where can they invest their time, money, and energy on managing habitats? Where can they invest their limited conservation dollars? Those kind of decisions require surveying, right? Rapid assessments. You don't have a lot of time to do it, right? So Soundscape is actually the best tool they can invest, right? Because they can actually deploy that tool, those recording devices, in multiple habitats at the same time, collect the data at the same time, and then make a decision at the same time, right? So that kind of data you collect through Soundscape are very well equipped. They are robust enough to or reliable enough to make natural resource policies, conservation policies, right? Wildlife management policies, right? So, well, what's the problem with the other alternative? Alternative is actually doing this by field surveys. Well, there's a surveyor bias, right? Many surveys are only trained to survey for certain taxa, right? Large taxa, right? Large sized animals, charismatic animals are easy to detect, right? There are many people who can actually detect them. So there's a surveyor bias, right? And that's an imperfect detection. Not all animals can be detected at any given time, right? Certain species are only surface active for a very limited period of time. Amphibians in particular, certain birds that are migratory, will not spend much time in a particular location. So all of that leads to imperfect detection, and also there is surveyors' weakness, right? That actually may render them less effective in doing a proper survey. Costs. It costs time, it costs labor, right? You have to pay those people, right? And the time is also money, right? And so the detection, perfect detection, is a function of A, number of people doing the survey, B, number of hours they surveyed, right? So both of that translates back into money. These kind of surveys are not fit for long term, right? Because you'll have different people doing the survey. So then there is an inter-observer variation kicking in, right? So field surveys may not fit long-term goals, right? Or doing field surveys on long-term by manual labor, right, may actually introduce biases, right? And in contrast, the soundscape data, right, when you collect them, you can store them and analyze subsequently, right? When you store them, you might not have enough technology, cyber infrastructure, or computer science knowledge or skills to analyze them, but you can wait until that technology, that skill is available, right? So most of the environmental sentinels, right, most organisms that we consider indicators of environmental health are vocally active. Bats, for example, amphibians, well, anurans and toads, for example, birds, forest birds, grassland birds are vocally active, right? So those are actually not only the animal, but their bioacoustics, right? Their biophony is also an indicator of environmental health. Oh, before I go over there, I want to introduce the topic rapid biodiversity assessments. Everything I explained over here, right, using soundscape, right, to do a quick, fast and easy, convenient biodiversity survey is actually a form of a rapid biodiversity assessment, right? And in the diagrams I'm actually showing like commercially available soundscape recording devices, as well as ones that actually you can make yourself, right, by going to a Radio Shack and buying stuff, right? And in this one, actually this cell phone is actually one of those burner phones that people have used to actually develop recording devices, right? Because it's a burner phone, you can even actually kind of program the phone to periodically text sound files from this location through a GSM tower to your lab computer, right? So this is kind of a very typical standard pathway workflow how soundscape recording acoustic monitoring works, right? You have a sensory technology that actually sense the soundscape, right? And then you actually have to deploy those sensors according to a particular design. You have to stratify those sensors across maybe different years, within the year, in different seasons, across different habitats. So you have to think about how to stratify your sensor technology across time and across space. C, metadata. Well, alongside the soundscape data, what other data are you going to record? Well, climate data, weather data, habitat structural data. Well, you can actually use other remote sensing devices like satellites, drones, airplanes with optic cameras, or a combination of those to actually record the landscape and the local habitat structure. So what kind of other metadata you collect on top of the audio data, right, is really important to understand. D, processing. Now you need to actually clean up, process, right? What is the background? Right? What is the geophony? What is the anthrophony? What is the technophony? What is the biophony? So you have to like clean up, separate, tidy up, and then once you tidy it up, you need to identify the specific sources, right? Detect the species in your biophony, right? In terms of anthrophony, detect different sources of the sounds, right? And then finally, once you do that kind of fine-tune species identification, then you go into actual statistical analysis, calculate indexes, right? Try to understand the species richness, species composition, occupancy, presence, absence, right? Relative abundance of each species, right? So like that, you can either go to those statistical analysis or do other alternative soundscape metrics. So that's the basic, very typical workflow or the information pipeline associated with automated passive acoustic recording, right? This is kind of the same principle I'm going to explain with respect to bats over here. First, you actually have, like what happens over here is based on the data you recorded, cleaned up, after cleaning up, you look at or you produce your spectrogram, right? And then what you do is you further fine-tune your spectrogram into different units, right? You kind of undergo different variable temporal resolutions and try to pick up very subtle differences in that particular soundscape, right? And then ultimately you extract very specific features from the soundscape and then subject those extracted features for different classification, right? And that kind of classification can use different types of artificial intelligences, right? Different types of artificial intelligence algorithms, right? And um, and with further fine tuning, right, you can actually understand different species by understanding, the very unique features that you extracted from that sonogram. Um, so just to summarize, what can we learn, right? Um, about the environment based on soundscape analysis. Presence, absence, occupancy of a particular species, right? And based on that, you can actually develop species inventories, right? Spatial trends or patterns in species occupancy, right? And you can actually compare those occupancy patterns with respect to other environmental variables then, right? um, and then again, turning a notch up, well, not just presence, absence, now you can actually identify abundance, density, population sizes, or proxies of population sizes, right? And what kind of a data type are we using? In this case, well, spatial and temporally explicit detection counts, right, or for a single species, because we are looking at abundance, right? We are looking at a single species. So in that case, you are looking at individual detection counts for a particular species, where you actually can pinpoint to a particular time of the day and to a particular location, right? So the example is actually, how does species abundance vary with respect to variable vegetation cover? So the example would be estimating density or abundance of a particular targeted species, maybe a rare species or an endangered species, and try to understand how different environmental conditions, right, spatial structures impact the variability in that species' relative abundance, right? Um, Again, turning another notch up, right? Spatial and temporal variations, trends in behavioral patterns, right? In this case, you actually have to detect variations, differences in soundscape detections and kind of tie that up to a particular single species behavioral modifications, right? So the example for that could be actually modeling relationship between a particular species behavior and what environmental parameters are driving that behavior, right? Another example is actually monitoring the phenology, right, and the activity phenology driven activity patterns, behavioral patterns of a particular species, right? So the best example to think about that is actually monitoring the circadian or seasonal activity patterns of a particular migratory bird or a migratory butterfly, right? Well, I don't think butterflies actually have a vocal signature, so scratch that. Some other migrating insect, right, or insect that emerges with respect to phenological changes. So that can be used to understand the impacts of climate change, right? And also, right, if you think about if you can apply the presence absence data to different species, you can actually enumerate species richness, right, and understand the how species richness, number of species can change with respect to a particular environmental change, maybe different levels of urbanization, right? And then of course apply the same principle at a community and develop acoustic indexes. I explained different acoustic indexes before and how that is applicable to different communities. And you can even use same principles to understand within a species intraspecific level variations of the soundscape, right? And that can be helpful to understand variation in a single species vocal repertoires, right? What drives those repertoire variations? Well, how does social behavior is structured around those variation in individual specific vocal repertoires, right? How can that translate into mate selection, group selection, right, or cohesion of a particular socially defined or quasi socially defined species like birds, right? Or does social insects use any sort of a soundscape signature, to keep their group cohesion, right? How does cetaceans use those vocal signatures to migrate in pods, in groups? Well, so those are actually, there are many applications of soundscape that we can keep thinking about. many applications of soundscape, not that we can keep thinking about, that I can bring up examples for. This is a very unique example how soundscape can be how decoding the soundscape can help us understand mutualism, right? So this is a very interesting mutualistic interaction between a microbat, a bat that actually emits that feeds on insects, right? Uh, the name is Kerivaula hardwicki. The English name is Hardwicki's woolly bat. The name is up there. And a pitcher plant from the genus Nepenthes, right? Nepenthes hemsliana. So usually Nepenthes actually is a pitcher plant, a carnivorous plant that attracts insects, drowns them, kills them, and digests them to absorb nitrates, nutrients, right? Carnivorous plants are photosynthetic, but they usually grow in nutrient poor soil, so they have to actually have a different mechanism to absorb nitrates and phosphates. So carnivorous plants do that by killing insects. In this case, Nepenthes, the pitcher plants, has actually evolved a completely different strategy to obtain nourishment that doesn't involve luring and killing insects. Instead, they actually provide a suitable roosting sites for the Hardwicki's woolly bat, right? So the bat approaches this particular pitcher, moves inside the pitcher, roosts there, and take a shit there, right? They actually dump, they deposit their scat, right? And scat contains so much nitrates and phosphates, right? So bat gets a place to live, a safe place. There are no threat there, and these places can only fit, these pitchers can only accommodate a single bat at a time, right? So it's predator free, free of snakes, free of other predators, and actually the parasite density in these pitchers are also very low, right? And in fact, the question is, how does the soundscape comes in here? How does a bat recognizes a particular pitcher? Well, it's not by the vision. Well, these bats are not with poor vision, but that vision itself is not enough to recognize the actual structure of the pitcher, because the interior of the pitcher is not visible to bat. How that happens is by actually bat emitting ultrasonic signatures, and the reflector, this particular reflector of the pitcher, right, actually kind of indicates or rather reflects the interior morphology of the pitcher, right? I mean, try to think about here, right? The interior morphology of the pitcher is not visible to the eye of the bat. So what happens is the bat emits a call, it kind of bounces off the reflector, from the reflector it bounces into the pitcher, and from the interior of the pitcher it bounces back to the reflector, and from the reflector back to the bat, right? So this particular part right beneath the lid, right, is extremely important in reflecting the ultrasonic signatures back towards the bat, that conveys so much information about the suitability of the pitch interior for that particular bat to roost, right? So without actually decoding the soundscape in these two species interactions, we would never be able to understand this beautiful mutualistic association between those two species, right? And then we can actually, there are so many new species that have been described, identified based on soundscape, right? Sometimes 100% based on soundscape, in certain occasions in combination with soundscape, right? So there are particular species called cryptic species, taxonomically or phylogenetically cryptic species. What does that mean? Meaning those species do not differ that much from morphology, from their physical appearance, from the habitat they utilize. They look very similar, right? So conventional strategies we use to separate species will not work to identify those species. Genetically, those species are different. They may have been separated from each other million years ago, but their morphology is in stasis. It doesn't change due to some weird reason. But in order to make sure the mating happens within the same species, they have evolved different advertisement calls. What is an advertisement call? Advertisement call is the calls emitted by the male individuals to attract females, right? So, because morphologically they look similar, because they actually could occupy the same habitat in the same geographical area, the physical appearance is not a good strategy to drive mate selection. So that's why the advertisement call has evolved a completely different vocal signature, right? Which prevents interspecific hybridizations, which enhances the probability that the same species actually continues to breed. Many examples come from South America, right? This example to the right, you are looking at 6 different vocal signatures of 6 different species of frogs, right? From the Andean tropical forests that occupy the understory of this Andean tropical forest, moist forests, right? That's 6 different species. Morphologically, they look identical, right? But if you sample the soundscape, you actually see massive differences in their vocal signatures, right? Now, these species in the South American rainforest environments or South American humid forest environments, they are hard to detect by conventional surveys, right? Either they occupy very weird microhabitats. Sometimes they could actually call from the leaf litter. Sometimes they could call from like a very hidden areas of the understory foliage, right? And their behavior is very erratic and unpredictable, right? So conventional herpetofaunal surveys are very unlikely to detect them. And the worst case is these amphibians are very rare. Their densities are very low, right? So chances of you not detecting them is very high for all of those reasons. So I'm talking about one of the genus that is widespread in the Amazon, right? The genus is widespread, Euthodactylus, but some of those species are quite rare, right? Very low in densities. The species could be widespread, but in a given location, they could occur in very, very low densities. So within different species of this genus, right, despite their morphological conservatism, the pulse signatures, number of pulses per call, differed. The duration of the call or the time length of the call differed. The dominant frequency within a call differed. Distribution of the energy within a call is different, right? Pulse aggregation across different calls differed. So there were so many acoustic metrics that differed across different species, right? So without soundscape, you would pull all of those species as a single species and you would underestimate the true diversity of Amazonian frogs in that way. Thanks to soundscape, we actually know how truly diverse these species are, right? And even in this particular paper I read, they actually, based on the soundscape complexity or the complexity of the acoustic signatures of each species and their current geographic distribution, right? They even try to infer their colonization patterns and the speciation patterns based on that. It's pretty bizarre what you can do with the soundscape signatures, because complex soundscapes evolve from simple soundscape, right? So more complicated acoustic signatures evolved recently, right? So that's actually kind of the very basic assumption they actually played from, which is a very reasonable assumptions to have. And also there are similar research done in other tropical countries, like in Western Ghats of India. They also identified new species based on soundscape, right? So now, right, you can actually have kind of a three-way integration to study taxonomy and phylogeny to describe new species, to understand new evolutionary patterns, right? The conventionally, you have the morphometrics, where you actually catch a species, look at its limb structure, limb length, skeletal elements, sizes of different body appendages. That's actually how we mostly describe species. And then of course we have this meristic, right, like taking counts, right, can be also useful. But those morphological features are actually less useful if the species is cryptic, right? So then you can actually have two other approaches. One is bioacoustics, the second one is the molecular phylogenetics. So now you have 3 lines of evidence to actually identify new species. I also read another paper that actually proposed the same approach to understand diversity of insects, right? Um, so the same principle, sampling the soundscape in aquatic environments, have been used to identify cryptic species, right, in environments that are hard to survey by conventional fisheries techniques, right. Rare cryptic fish species, Cusk's eel, right, Ophidion, is actually a rare endemic sand-dwelling Mediterranean fish. By the way, Mediterranean environments are very unique in terms of biodiversity. Both terrestrial and aquatic habitats are unique, right? These species, they are sand-dwelling, so it's very hard to detect them by conventional surveys. The surveys that are used, conventional surveys that have been used to detect these animals, are very kind of invasive. It kind of disturbs the bottom substrate. So soundscape techniques can actually be very helpful to understand these very secretive species that are hard to detect. So although these cusk eels is distributed along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean environment, right? No study have actually reported or has confirmed its presence in very specific points within its known range, right? You kind of assume it to be distributed in this particular environment, but there has been no evidence to confirm its presence within different areas, right? So passive acoustic monitoring has been conducted during summer of 2009 at one of these marine protected areas within this area, right, and closer to Italy, and that actually provided evidence for vocal signatures of this rare endemic fish present in that particular marine protected area, which actually increases the value of that particular conservation land, or well, conservation seascape, right. So the sounds were actually kind of was unique to this particular species. It has these long trains of low frequency pulses, showing the typical and unique pulse pattern period alterations that is unique to this particular eel species, right? That is emitted only by the male individuals as a reproductive call to recruit females. So there are two lines of evidence getting here. A, there are species. Two, they are reproducing, right? So you verify the presence of the species and of course a proxy of its continuous recruitments, right? So kind of soundscape ecology, especially if you are surveying through male vocalizations or reproductive advertisement calls, you are actually not only sampling the presence of the species or their activity patterns or their densities, you actually are collecting evidence for their reproduction, right? So this particular research I'm talking about happened to be the first reported case where passive acoustic monitoring have enabled identification of a cryptic rare species in marine environments where visual surveys are untenable or impossible, right? Or where such conventional studies have never been conducted, right? Now with this passive recording technology, you can actually continue to collect data on the presence, densities, or distribution of that particular species in that environment, and replicate that study throughout its range. So these passive monitoring devices, it's a great tool in taxonomy, like you just figured it out. It's also helpful in monitoring for conservation applications to understand priority sites, right? So this cryptic species identification has been used across many different taxa. In this case, we are talking about a bird, jungle flycatcher, right? A particular taxon that was originally thought to be a single species is now considered to be multiple species, right? As you can see in this graph, right, you are actually recognizing multiple species when you plot, right, different metrics of the soundscape. I am not expecting you to understand what these graphs indicate in detail, so just to break it down, each graph is a principal component analysis. What you do is you measure they measured about 6 to 11 different metrics of the soundscape, right? And then subjected that 16 metrics to principal component analysis. Well, those 6 to 16 soundscape metrics you measure, they could actually be correlated with each other. In order to remove that autocorrelation, they actually did the principal component analysis, which kind of combines, not filters, combines all those 6 to 11 measurements and derive kind of a fundamental measurement that indicates there are proxies of all these basic measurements they did, right? And then they created plots that explains the overall soundscape variation of those species. And you can see that each ellipse you see in these plots, right, indicates a single population of that particular species. In certain cases, you actually see major overlaps of different populations. So in that case, you don't have much evidence for species separation. For example, if you look at this particular one, these two populations overlap quite a lot. Some overlap in different populations. Here, one population completely occurs within the other population, right? But if you look at here, 100% separation of the two populations based on the soundscape metrics. Some separations. Yeah, some separations. So what you're looking at is substantial soundscape based evidences for species separation, right? Earlier, people thought these were the same species but different populations, but now we know that actually, right, that single species possibly could belong to 10 different cryptic species. So they didn't stop at just soundscape analysis. They actually followed up with DNA analysis. They used actually mitochondrial DNA and genomic DNA, nuclear genomic DNA, to decode the soundscape. Not decode the soundscape, to understand the actual species separation. In fact, the molecular taxonomy supported the 10 cryptic species they actually figured based on the soundscape. So the bioacoustic signatures are in agreement with the molecular data. So in fact, those 10 different species are biologically meaningful 10 different species. A very similar example for another cryptic species of Amazonian frogs. I talked about Amazon frogs earlier, but now I'm talking about them again from a different environment, right? Early it was the Andean highlands. Now we are looking at actually kind of the lowlands of the Amazonian basin, right? So in this particular species, these two cladogram represents the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA, and each color corresponds to a possibility of a separate species, right? So the photograph is actually the photograph of the 6 different species that are morphologically looks very similar. You might see some subtle color changes, but that's not good enough, right? Generally, those species are very similar in morphology, in the measurements, in the color patterns, right? And so if you actually take body measurements like limb lengths, limb widths, head depths, body lengths, right, and try to understand differences in terms of those morphological features, as you can see in this principal component analysis, they are not that different from each other, right? But if you do the same principal component analysis based on sound signatures, now you start to see significant variation in those species, right? So this analysis is actually for one genus, species, right? Their richness actually jumped from 2 species to about 7 species. That is nearly 250% increase in the true species richness. Thanks to soundscape ecology, right? We are able to understand the actual species richness of these diversity rich Amazon landscapes. This actually is I taken it out from the same study now based on a particular tree frog. The same story, right? Originally, they actually had 2 species, but after doing soundscape analysis, they actually recognized about 9 species, right? Again, soundscape ecology helping us to understand, elucidate the actual diversity of diversity rich habitats Again, we can see the congruence between molecular taxonomy and soundscape, right? The morphology, right? Look how similar these 6 species are. They are very similar, right? Maybe some color differences in this thigh muscle, right? But look at the morphology. Does not help. The body measurements does not help, do not help to separate the species. Soundscape does separate them very well. And now about from an example from bat world, right? How Miniopterus bats can be separated into different species in the Malagasy landscape, right? So the number of Miniopterus bat species in the Malagasy area that combines the Comoro Islands and Madagascar together, right, has actually increased in the recent past from 4 species to 11. That actually tells you there are more species that are undescribed. So recently described taxa have been differentiated primarily based on molecular data, right, from molecular phylogenetic analysis, followed up by like fine-tuned morphological characterization, right, revealed true diversity of Miniopterus bats in this beautiful part of the African world. This is an old world genus, and they are notably conservative in their morphology throughout their ranges. If I give you this 11 species of Miniopterus bats, you can hardly tell the species differences, right? So several sites in Madagascar hold up to about 4 different small bodied taxa in this particular genus that are morphologically very similar, comparable. But if you look into their tragus structure, the ear-like structure that is on their nose, that kind of helps them to decode the echolocation, is different. But other than that, rest of the body morphology isn't that different from each other. So, but if you actually analyze their soundscape, right, soundscape signatures are also going to be massively different, right? And in fact, the soundscape helps to reveal further existence of diversity within these particular 11 species, right? And in fact, they did found smaller variations around the allometric relationship between the body sizes and the peak echolocation frequency of these Malagasy bats. And this study also suggested that intraspecific communication or evolution of intraspecific communication within the same species is actually as the driver, not the intraspecific competition for prey selection, as the driving force of the variation in the echolocation, right? And in fact, through soundscape analysis, you can actually understand ongoing variations in the vocal signatures, right, that actually might suggest an ongoing processes of speciation, right? So in this case, the complete species separation may not have happened, but could be happening. In this case of bats, what we might be experiencing is actually an ongoing process of speciation, right? That's kind of the coolest story I can actually envision. It's so cool. Imagine what you are looking at is evidence for evolution happening in front of your own eyes, right? Genetically, they may not be that much different. Morphologically, they may not be but different, but their vocal signatures are evolving towards a particular direction. I want to end this lecture by talking about the open source software application tools that is available to decode the soundscape, right? So first, C-Wave, right? Warbler. Forget C-Wave and Warbler. First, what kind of statistical software that we have that helps you to do data cleaning, data wrangling, data pipelining, data mining from databases and analyzing that data is a free, 100% free on web-based, or actually online-based tool. You can actually download it, install on your laptop. You can actually engineer that to work offline, but also you can keep it as an online tool. I use it as an online tool, using online to technology real time to decode the soundscape, right? It's free. It's hard to learn. Like it has a sharp learning curve because it's not a drop down system, right? It's not like a click and point kind of a tool, right? It's not like Excel. So all the analysis you have to actually type in as a code, relatively simple code, but you have to learn it, right? So there's a very steep learning curve. You have to be good at learning computer languages. You have to have some basic computer skills. But the advantage of learning something like that is it is freely available. No one can take it away from you, right? You could be dirt poor as a scientist, but that will not stop you from doing cool science because it's free, right? C-Wave and Wobbler is actually two packages that are based on R and sound ecology, right? Three packages, not the only three packages, three of the most widely used packages that you can use to decode, analyze the soundscape in R software, right? So all those packages are also free, right? So there's actually a huge community, right, that combines biologists, ecologists, behavioral analysts, mathematicians, statisticians, data scientists, computer scientists, right? There's a multidisciplinary scientific field that work together to produce this free open access online software and packages, right? And actually I'm proud to say I'm a part of that community, right? The tools that I explained to you that I work with MIT, that is free of charge. The entire AI code, every fucking line we write is available to people, right? So we are not working behind a firewall. No, we are not trying to. So I need you to understand that there's a huge scientific community that actually are making, are actually doing their job is to make things available free of charge for you guys, right? And we might not become rich out of that, right? But the satisfaction is our goal, right? Yes, it's a job. We get paid to develop these tools, but but we are not making money out of that. That's what I want you to understand. Well, enough about self-promotion. DataOne, that's actually another open source platform for data storage. It's heavily used for ecological data. And then other data libraries. Cornell's Lab of Ornithology have this Maclay library that actually stores a copious amount of information that is freely available to anyone for training their AIs, for self-training, for educational purposes. So this field is still not that evolved as an open source platform. Like you can recall, Professor Amor is training you on a software tool that is not free. So this licensed expensive software is not going anywhere for the next 100 years, right? But what we are observing is actually, a handful of us are investing in developing free and open source tools. The disadvantage is these free open source tools are hard to learn. You have to be good at computer science, right? But the paid expensive software are relatively easy to use, right? And not to mention that it doesn't have learning curve, because I personally know how much Professor Amor invests herself in actually teaching it, learning it herself, right? She took quite a bit of time and pride in doing that, and like as she should. But I do want to encourage you guys to actually, while learning that kind of tools, also do not forget to train yourself in free and open source software. Keep that in your mind. If you get time, I know you guys are busy, right? But in your careers, when you move into jobs, do invest time in contributing to or learning these open source platforms. Well, with that, I conclude all my lectures in Soundscape Ecology.